You're all very welcome here this evening. So on behalf of the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action, Queen's University Belfast and the ESRC's Festival of Social Science, you're all very welcome to this night's discussion on workplace democracy, or why should democracy end at the factory door, the office door, or indeed the classroom door. So I'm John Barry. I'm the Director of the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action. I'll be chairing as well as speaking at tonight's event. So just to let you know the format, my colleague, Dr. Keith Breen, will make some opening remarks, particularly around the philosophical normative arguments for extending democracy to the workplace. Then Gawain Morrison will talk more from a practitioner's point of view of being involved in workplaces that are democratic, semi-democratic, or self-organised. And then I'll make a few comments at the end in terms of some ecological basically democratic reasons, in terms of we tend to think we live in democracies, yet for many of us who are lucky enough to have a job, for 8 hours a day, we live in despotisms. We live in non-authoritarian work organisations. So I'll be linking those issues around a democratic society. How can a democratic society in a way coexist with these non-democratic workplaces? But also, what are some of the more ecological and climate reasons for perhaps extending democracy to the workplace? So I'll hand over to my colleague, Keith Breen.
Thanks, John. So I'm going to take something like 20 minutes to talk through some of the philosophy. I've written on workplace democracy, and I've been interested in the topic since 2004, so I've been pursuing it for a while. What I've got here is some arguments for extending democracy into the workplace. Only some arguments. There are many, many arguments, and I'm going to focus in on a particular, 3 particular arguments, but they're very influential arguments. So I'm going to explore 3, and the focus is freedom. Okay, there's many, many different values that you can appeal to in justifying workplace democracy, but the value I'm primarily appealing to is freedom. So I'm going to look at 2 very venerable arguments for workplace democracy. They're called the psychological support argument and the parallel case argument, and I'm going to explain what they are. They go back at least to the 19th century. Key socialists make these arguments, but other people make them too. And then I'm going to review some problems with these 2 venerable arguments. I don't think that these problems undermine them completely, but there are problems that, if you're skeptical about workplace democracy, you would focus in on these problems. And I want to fight back the skeptic. And I'm going to do so by reviewing the Republican argument for workplace democracy, which is based upon a particular understanding of freedom. There's many understandings of freedom, but this is an understanding of freedom understood as non-domination. And what I mean by Republican, I mean in the Republican political theory, political philosophy tradition, stretching right back to Cicero. Though Cicero wasn't a workplace democrat by any means, but the appeal to freedom as non-domination goes back to Roman times. And there's been a revival of Republican thinking in contemporary political theory, in contemporary political philosophy. So that's what I'm going to focus on. Okay, a preliminary. And what is workplace democracy? I draw from a guy called, he's Vietnamese, American Vietnamese, so his name is Shu, but there is at the top. He offers a really, I think, useful definition of workplace democracy, which captures various institutional forms. So he writes, workplace democracy is a regime in which workers are institutionally guaranteed. So they're institutionally guaranteed the right to participate in determining the policies that affect them and to participate in governing the enterprise. So governing is a really important word. It's about rule. It's about control. Okay. Now, this is where people might disagree with me, but I think workplace democracy can take various institutional forms. Possibly the weaker institutional form is co-determination. And Germany is the country which is most famous for co-determination. So co-determination of enterprise policies, right through to cooperativism, okay, where workers both determine policy and typically they own the means of production, okay, which isn't the case with co-determination. It can be direct or indirect. In small companies, everybody can be directly involved in decision making. But in large firms and enterprises, that might not be possible. So you'd have a representative form of democracy within large firms and enterprises, as you have with Mondragon, which is a series of a conglomeration of cooperatives based in the Basque region of Spain. What I tell my students, and I deliver a lecture on this every year, don't confuse workplace democracy with consultation rights. Okay? Unions have consultation rights. What they don't have control. They don't enjoy a guaranteed position within the governance of, for example, Queen's. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the first venerable argument. That's called the psychological support argument. That was made by John Stuart Mill, one of the most important liberal thinkers of the 19th century. It was also made by Carol Pateman in the 1970s in a great book, Democracy and Participation. It does appeal to an ideal of freedom. And the ideal of freedom which is appealed to is the ideal of freedom understood as self-determination, determining your own future, or autonomy. That's autonomy is from the Greek autos, which means self, and nomos, which means law. So autonomy means you're somebody who's able to give yourself the law that you live by. And also an Aristotelian sense of freedom, which is slightly different. It's about self-realization. It's about realizing your potentials as a human being. So what's the argument? The argument focuses on the psychological conditions which must be in place for us to have a vibrant democracy at the level of the state or within the political sphere. So what's the preconditions of having a vibrant democratic state? Okay. Well, people have to learn to be good citizens, right? A vibrant democratic state requires people who have learned good citizenship. And here I draw from a guy called Joshua Cohn, but he's ultimately drawing from Mill and Pateman. What makes a good citizen? The first thing that makes a good citizen is that they have active characters. Okay. What's meant by active characters? They are people who are convinced they can change the world. Okay. They believe that change is desirable and there's possibility. And they're willing to get up and do things about the world to effect change. The second precondition is a sense of the common good. Okay? They must have learned through making judgments, making decisions, what is in the interest not of themselves, but in the interest of everybody. Okay? So they must have a capacity for mature judgment, and this must be allied to a commitment to the public interest, or what I have here is public spiritedness. Now, what is wrong with authoritarian firms, non-democratic firms? Well, what's wrong with authoritarian firms is that because they exclude workers from decision making, they encourage passivity and they undermine our powers of judgment because we don't exercise decision making within these authoritarian workplaces. This is a consequentialist argument in the sense that authoritarian hierarchical firms have bad consequences for the development of our character. Now, you'll find that this is an argument you'll find in the critical theory tradition. Theodore Adorno makes this argument about capitalist workplaces. So if we want to have a vibrant political democracy. So just we need to have democracy within the workplace, because the workplace is an institution where people, their character is formed. Okay? Just like schools. If we want to have a next generation of citizens who are open to democracy, we need to instill democratic values in schools. So the argument works from the level of the workplace as character forming to the state. Okay. So that's the psychological support argument. A psychological support argument is it's that workplace democracy leads to psychological conditions which will lead to better political democracy at the level of the state. Parallel case argument is quite different. The guy who's most responsible for this is a guy called Robert Dahl, and he makes the argument in a great book from 1980, I think it's 1982, A Preface to Economic Democracy. Robert Dahl was really interesting. He's the most eminent 20th century political scientist from the United States. And unlike most people, as he got older, and he lived until around 98, he got more and more radical. You know, so usually it's the other way around. And in this argument, he appeals to the ideal of autonomy and self-determination. And he writes, so this is his key idea: if democracy is justified in governing the state, then it must also be justified in governing economic enterprises. So the argument is different to the parallel case argument. The parallel case argument begins with the workplace and moves to the state. The psychological support argument. The parallel case argument, the movement of justification is in the opposite direction. If democracy is justified at the level of the state, then it's got to be justified in the workplace. Why? Because there's key structural parallels between these two institutions. And if these are similar, well then democracy is justified in both these institutions. So why is democracy justified at the level of the state? If you're a Democrat, first point, state rules, decisions are binding in all members of the state. That's the first thing. So everybody's affected by these decisions, these rules. Two, and this is the anti-Platonic point, ordinary citizens are capable of judging the acceptability, the defensibility of these rules and decisions. This is key to democracy. If you're a Platonist, you don't believe in equality. You think most people are dumb, so you need to have philosopher kings ruling. But key to democracy, in a minimal sense, is that everybody ought to have an equal say. Because there is an assumption that there's an egalitarian starting point to democracy. Okay. Here's another key point. Citizens are under the power of state authorities, and state authorities coercively enforce rules, and there's an extremely limited exit option. What do I mean by exit option? It's very hard to get out of your state, right? Unless you're Gerard Depardieu and Putin is willing to give you Russian citizenship, it's very hard to exit states, okay? Now, if 1, 2, and 3 are true, well, that justifies citizens having a democratic voice. Okay? That's the justification. Now, let's look at the workplace, Dahl says. He says, well, 1, enterprise rules and decisions affect all employees, right? All members. Secondly, and again, this is the anti-Platonic point, workers are capable of appropriately judging these rules and decisions. Okay? And in fact, they probably have better knowledge than a good deal of managers, and they definitely have better knowledge than stockholders. Okay? Workers are under the power of managerial authorities who enforce decisions through sanctions. The most powerful sanction being dismissal. And most workers, especially in really tight labour markets, have limited exit options. And there's real costs in our society. One major cost of exiting a firm is potentially unemployment. So if 1, 2, and 3 are justified, 1, 2, or 3 are true, then a democratic employee voice is justified within the workplace. So the It's because of the strong similarities. Right. Now, people have pushed back against these arguments, and I'm not necessarily agreeing with this pushback. The first, but I have to register them, and it sets up my next argument. John, tell me to shut up whenever. So the first sort of argument against the psychological support argument is that empirically there's a dispute over whether workplace democracy actually increases workers' public spiritedness or sense of political efficacy. And there's two guys, Eldon and Greenberg, and in the 1980s they studied where's Seattle? Washington State. There was quite a number of plywood cooperatives. And these political scientists looked at them and they tried to ask whether these democratic forms of workplaces did actually lead to more active, workers being more active political citizens. And they disagreed. Okay, so there's no agreement on that. And the second problem is that even if it does make workers more politically efficacious as citizens, it might not make them politically, it might not make them or commit them to the common good. It could lead them to endorsing workerism, pursuing politically only their own interests. Okay. The third issue, I think, is this is a consequentialist justification. Okay. Workplace democracy is justified because it has good consequences, and the good consequences being better political democracy. But it can vary from case to case. It might be true in case A, but it might not be true in case B or workplace C. So it's a contingent justification. Now the parallel case argument, people still defend it, and some really, really brighter people than me still defend it, but there are issues with it. The first one is, excuse me, the first one is the parallel is overdrawn. Okay, the parallel is overdrawn. The analogy doesn't hold. Why doesn't hold? Well, the state and the workplace are very different institutions. Okay, though they may like to be able to imprison you or even kill you, it's only states that do that. So to quote Max Weber, the state, unlike the corporation, has a monopoly over legitimate violence. And the scope of the state's reach is very, very extensive as compared to your average workplace. The second argument is that membership in states is typically compulsory, whereas membership of workplaces is typically optional. And if that's true, then the analogy doesn't hold. There is no justification for equality of voice within firms, especially if you've got a right of exit. Mayer makes the argument, if you're able to exit firms, and if you've got some sort of financial cushion, so you've got a good social wage or something like a UBI, then don't worry about it. We don't need workplace democracy. I have a big question mark about that. The argument for right of exit as being sufficient to ensure our freedom, I think, is a seriously deficient argument. I think I'll come to that. Okay, this is the one that I want to, this is the one I think it's got more gas to it. And it's the Republican argument, which focuses on freedom as non-domination. I think the other arguments are important, but this one I think is, maybe it's less vulnerable. So recently, Republicans such as Shea and Gonzalez-Ricoy have turned to the Republican ideal of freedom, which is freedom as non-domination. Now, to defend workplace democracy, or at least very significant changes to workplaces. Now, non-domination is a particular understanding of freedom. It's, you enjoy non-domination when you're not vulnerable to arbitrary interference. Now, the key term is arbitrary interference. So think of a Roman slave back in the day, 2,000 years ago. A Roman slave was vulnerable to arbitrary interference. What do I mean by arbitrary interference? Well, she or he could have had a very benign master who had no real intention of interfering, but they always had the capacity to interfere. Okay? That's the key thing, the capacity to interfere. And not just the capacity, the uncontrolled or arbitrary capacity to interfere. Why is the arbitrary capacity to interfere bad? Because it leads to domination. Even if you had a benign master or a benign mistress back in, if you were a Roman slave, as many highly educated Greek tutors did have, because they were valued as assets, you never knew that after a big banquet, when they drank too much wine, that they might beat the living daylights out of you the next day or even kill you, right? So that's the badness. So the badness of domination, and here I draw from an Irish philosopher, Philip Pettit, who actually studied in Belfast, in Queens back in the late 60s. He said, what is the badness of domination? The badness of domination is threefold. Well, it's really fundamentally and philosophically and ethically and morally, is the badness of domination is that it denies, when people are dominated, their personal worth is undermined. Their self-respect is undermined. In what way? Well, if A dominates B, that fact of domination, even if they're benign, okay, undermines B's sense of personal worth, self-respect, by fostering first uncertainty, anxiety. And when you're uncertain and you're anxious, you're not in a position to plan your life, because you never know what's going to come, right? It undermines your personal worth and self-respect because it encourages you to be a toady, to engage in demeaning strategies of placating the potential dominator. That's undermining. And psychologically, you recognize, and everybody recognizes, that you are a subordinate, and you internalize that. So you internalize that subordinate status, and that undermines our status as equals. Rawls says the most important thing to lead a successful life, a meaningful life, is the value of self-respect. If you don't have that, you don't have a meaningful life. Okay? John Rawls, he's a very famous liberal political philosopher who died in 2002, I think. Okay, so, and I won't spend too much longer on this, John. So why can we, from the value of freedom as non-domination, how do we get to workplace democracy? Well, the simple fact that in authoritarian firms, where managers have control, and they in turn are controlled by owners, but in big corporations, the owners aren't the ones in control. It's the managers, the CEOs are the ones that are in control. That prerogative, managerial prerogatives in authoritarian firms, can lead to enduring forms of domination. In what way? And at what level? So, at the most basic level, in the activity of workers, in the performance of their work. Let me give you an example. There was chicken factories in the United States, poultry factories, where the rate of production was so fast that supervisors insisted that workers could not have toilet breaks. There's a great book about this. It's called Void Where Prohibited. That led to workers wearing adult diapers. Okay, and this isn't so long ago. This is only in the 1990s, right? So then there's the problem of potential arbitrary interference in conditions of employment. Okay. Or aspects of employment, arbitrary interference in our working conditions, in promotions, in training, in opportunities. And then there's a problem of arbitrary interference and domination at the strategic level, in terms of organizational policy, goals, and so forth. So an arbitrary relocation of a factory without taking into interests of the workers involved. A change of product, which proves problematic. And that can have really severe impact on workers. The next point, and here I draw from She against Mayer. Yeah, the right of exit is really important. That's what separates our society from feudalist society. In feudal society, peasants didn't have the right to exit their lord's estate. But even if you do enjoy the right of exit, there are very high costs sometimes to exiting firms. The first one is, if I were to leave Queens, So my boss is an asshole. I decided to leave Queen's after 20 years. I'm going to lose a lot of human capital. I know this institution backwards. I know the people here. I know who to go to if I've got a problem. So that's one thing you're going to lose. Then there's the cost of transitioning to a new job. My trade is very, very niche. Okay, I'd be lucky at my age to be able to secure a new job in a prompt fashion because the jobs aren't there, okay, in my area. And following that, there's a risk of unemployment. Okay, and we know if you read Yehuda and those sociologists of students of unemployment, she studied I think it was a mining town somewhere in Switzerland where the whole community was dependent upon the particular industry. It collapsed, massive unemployment. There's the psychological and somatic consequences of that on the community were very, very dramatic and negatively dramatic. So if you believe self-respect is a primary good and managerial arbitrary interference undermines it, then if you believe in freedom as non-domination, workplace democracy or some form of workplace democracy is justified. So that we can protect ourselves against domination. I'm going to finish with this, why I think it's potentially a better one, potentially stronger than the other arguments. Firstly, it doesn't appeal to controversial ideals of such as self-realization or authenticity. Everybody typically thinks domination is a bad thing. So then it can fit with different philosophical perspectives, whether you're liberal, whether you're socialist, and Marx offered a number of Republican-based arguments, or whether you're a centrist liberal. Typically, domination is viewed as a bad thing. Fascists don't think domination is a bad thing, but we think that their doctrines are unreasonable. Okay, well, nowadays we do. It's not reliant upon empirical variables, such as the psychological support argument is reliant on. And it doesn't presume a strong analogy between the state and the firm. It's focused entirely on the firm. Okay? And I would say that for any adequate theory, political theory, non-domination has got to be a focus, okay? Because non-domination is a foundational bad. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Keith. You've seen how we structure, sorry, Alan. We see how we structure academic arguments in terms of the logic of what Keith has suggested, like Lego blocks, bits fitting together. So next up we have Gawain to give us a view from a practitioner point of view. Or maybe you're a pracademic now, Gawain, as opposed to an academic.
Thank you, John. So guys, I'm going to come at this from a slightly different direction because a lot of what I've done over the years has been to do with creative projects, collaborative projects, some of them amongst a group of us, some of them for paid clients. And they'll be anecdotal, but interestingly, quite a few of the things that you just touched on, I've run into and felt. So I'm 25 years, I would call myself a creative producer across different sectors. I'm not going to have worked in coal mines, I'm not going to have worked in government, so I don't have those same structures. I've actually had a sense of freedom quite a lot of the way through this, and I do think that that's a very important component of this. I've worked across all of these different areas, and I'll touch a little on each of them, just from a concept point of view here, as how I've got to here. I've just touched your mic, sorry about that. In the late 90s, it was the rave culture, early 90s, it was rave culture, it was parties, it was anarchism, it was about doing stuff to upset the apple cart. We were coming at this from a point of view that we didn't want to do anything else. We enjoyed having parties, and they were on the ragged edge of being legal, and we did things as a group together. We ran on a club night that had four floors, and we brought a bunch of us together, and from just thinking from a business perspective and a group perspective, we needed bums on seats. So we put 3 DJs per floor, had a bunch of folks with 10 friends each, and all of a sudden we had a busy club. You do that over a period of 6 months, all of a sudden we are one of Belfast's best Friday nights. Over a pace of 5 years, we became one of Ireland's best Friday nights. And the act of doing it brought a sense of community and ownership to everybody that wanted to come to it. It wasn't just us. I was good at organising stuff, doing a few posters, doing the website. The boys that were DJing, they looked after their own floors. They told me what DJs we should get from across the planet. All of a sudden, we were making waves because everybody had their own skill sets, doing their own thing, and we had the freedom to be able to play. Now, this is a very anarchic kind of kickoff point for us. This is what formed the basis of sort of the model that we continued with through lots of different projects. I went from that into the film industry and stayed in the domain of creative producing. And the film industry, at least with clubbing and club events and doing those kinds of big events, you have that direct communication and live feedback from people. You're able to suss out whether it's working or it's not, and you're having fun or you're not, or you're doing something that's giving you that feedback loop. Filmmaking, you don't have that. You're siloed, plus as an industry, you're a group of very skilled individual humans doing individual things, coming together for a period of time, and then having to go off and scrabble and fight for what you're going to do next. And you have to trust each other implicitly, and I learned a lot from this industry, because you have to build up a proper trust with a bunch of people who are completely different to you, have a completely different skill set to you, and you're all trying to get to one common goal of getting something on a screen, and actually it still might be crap by the time you get to see it on the screen. So there's a lot of trust in them and a lot of risk in the moving image industries. And actually, you can only see the union is really starting to come together. You can see the writer's strike still having impacts now. In America, it's great. It's taken a long time for that to actually even become a thing over here. I went from that into tech. I'll sort of skip over these quite quickly, guys. We created the world's first, we were making films, we made the world's first emotional response horror film. There was a bunch of us did stuff actually with the guys in the Sonic Arts Research Centre here in Queens. And we wanted to make something that was dynamic and reactive to an audience in real time wherever we screened it, so it was unique for every screening experience. It led us off onto this journey because what we were using was biometric sensors. We were using it to measure the heart rate and the breathing rate of the audience, and it would then dynamically react. And it led us into me becoming a CEO of a tech company for 10 years, where we were looking and experimenting with data that were coming from people, and we did it in all manner of things, from sports to media to gaming, Northwest 200. We're doing it for broadcast, into research, market research. This scared the bejesus out of us. As a technology and something that we hadn't even expected we were going to end up in, we had daily conversations about what are we doing with this? I got called Oppenheimer twice in the whole time that I was doing it. It wasn't exactly creating an atom bomb, but people could see what you would be doing if data and people's data and ownership of self was being recorded and then controlled and manipulated. And so I ended up setting up with the IEEE Global Standards Committee around the use of empathic technologies. It's finishing now after 4 years. And we turned down a lot of business. We said no to military, we said no to casinos and gambling. We had a big telecommunications company from Far East ask us if we could do pre-crime using screens and TV advertising. It was on CCTV cameras, sorry. And it was unnerving the extent to where this could go. So it set a new bar in our consideration, that it wasn't just about us as a company and as a team. It wasn't just the processes of allowing people to be free in what they were doing. We had a duty of care to the technology and things we were doing to the communities, and not just our community. This was global kind of community territory. These technologies could go anywhere. So I changed the way I thought about how you actually have to reflect on rights, full stop. It wasn't just commercialization. It wasn't just what you do. It wasn't just being workers' rights. It was rights of everything in the sort of supply chain of whatever it happens to be. That company ended up going in the wall because of COVID, and it actually was probably a bit of a saving grace, but actually what I didn't touch on in that was the investor model for startups is insidious. It's a demonstration of capitalism gone wrong, if it ever went right, because everything about a startup is about high spend, high money in, high risk return. What am I going to get? And all the language used around it, 10, it's all very bullish, 10x multipliers, unicorns, yeah, we're going to be next Facebooks. And they're minuscule in terms of the gambling percentage success rates on that. but it's every waking moment of your life and everything to do with the startup and a company. It's insidious, it feeds into everything. And that is across the board, from the investors to the staff to the people you're trying to work with and sell to and do business with. So that whole thing needs to change in terms of, it has no control, it's out of control. And it needs to have an empowerment, a full new donut model, not just from an investment point of view for how we do that. But anyway, this was a beautiful project that allowed me to come back out of it, because it started us back into consideration of our place and planet. It was people, place and planet. And this was a culture night. This was us looking at what can we do for art and public interventions through the lens of sustainability. And it was quite a challenge and a wake-up call to sustainability is not easy, full stop. Because this should have been easy. This is pallets. We're in Northern Ireland. It should have been easy to use pallets and get rid of pallets again. It was a challenging project to try and do something that would have the smallest possible waste footprint. And the team that we brought together, we had no idea whether this would work. None whatsoever. And there were many, many people that came part of it and threw the shoulder to the wheel just to experiment and have a go. And it wasn't until we were turning it on at 6 o'clock on the Friday night for Culture Night that anybody was going to know whether it was going to work. And inherently, again, it was a trust. It was a freedom and a trust. Trust in each other, trust that it doesn't really matter. If it was a business and an industry that really mattered, it would be different. If it was life and death, it would be different. So I'm very conscious of that. But it allowed me to start to see sustainability in a much wider challenge for how could we do things. I just want to touch on this one quickly. This is a large global fizzy drinks company that I'm not going to say the name of, or we'll have the lawyers reaching through the screen. But this was an attempt to look at plastic recycling and get better people behaviour and incentivise to do plastic recycling. So we looked at everything. I was brought in as a consultant to look at this as a technical and creative idea, from the full circle of what you do, from making the plastic to putting it into bottles, to putting the drinks into it, to getting it out in the marketplace, to getting people to drink it, buy it, and then put it in the bin correctly, and then the whole recycling structure back into the waste management to get it back to where it needed to get to. This was 18 months worth of work with maybe 60 to 70 different people around the whole of the planet in 3 different countries, across multiple time zones, workshopping, coming up with ideas. Within this organization, we brought in multiple other consultancies and other companies to be part of the whole, solve a problem in the full round. And it was a difficult problem. Waste is so difficult, fragmentation, markets, all sorts of. It got shot down at the very last moment. It went to the very highest high. Everybody at that level said yes. It got to one human at the final part of the food chain. Now, of course, it could have been something different. We weren't privy to those conversations. And it went. And the amount of people that then left or disappeared off into other organizations, the lady who was leading on it, she went on sick and ended up leaving the company. So coming back to your point on the psychological impacts, the freedom to do something and then have it shut down because one person decides it's something different, the damage that does to the people in the company, but the company and what they do and where they go is staggering. So I just wanted to reference that. So all of this has brought us to this point of myself and a couple of other guys have started this CIC, a community interest company called Brink. And it's to look at climate change through the lens of cultural interventions to help people and be empowered to make some change in the face of what's coming at us from a climate point of view. Our approach to it is that it's got to be fun, or else it's not going back to our anarchic days of clubbing and filmmaking and everything else, and nobody's going to come on board and have a hoolie and run with it. You have to have it fun. So we're going to change how we look through the city through this lens of creative thinking and action by play. The only way this works is through unlikely partnerships and bringing people that you wouldn't normally sit at the table with to the table, having a bit of crack and saying, what do you think? Why not? What if? And we call it Brink because it's the point where we find each other. We're on the threshold of radical change for good and for bad. And if we don't get it right now, it's really going to impact on our tomorrow. you can't really make sense of this, but really this is just to give a quick diagram of it's all shoulders to the wheel. It's everybody's got to throw their shoulder to the wheel, and there's different models and there's different ways of having collaboration, cooperation, and some of them just do not, but they're going to have to find a way. And this is something we found. There's an open door we're pushing on all of this, because everybody in these organizations, they are humans. They're not stupid. They can see what's happening. They can feel they want to do something. And actually, we were talking the other day, John. The number one question, this is coming from the Northern Ireland Chamber, the CBI, some of the companies we've been talking to, the number one question that's being asked from young people, under 30s, walking into jobs now, when you're asked, what do you think, what do you want to ask of us, is what's your environmental policy, followed by what's your sustainable development goals? What are you doing that's good? And it's very interesting and competitive, and I'm referring more largely sort of the tech sector, but it is to the wider sector. It's a very competitive market, so they want to prove that they're good, and really there's a change in power. There's a change in power to do good because people are asking it for them to come and work with companies. So we believe that creative thinking, minds, art, innovation can make a difference. It's important to be able to embrace that to make a difference so we can actually live more connected, healthy lives. So we've been spending the last 12 months going around and asking in those different areas, in the civic, in the nature, in the academic, in the business sectors. We've been asking them what do they think are the challenges, what can we do, what would you do in the face of climate change, because it's this big tsunami that's going to hit us all. We were in with boys here in Sika. We brought students down to the site, and what we're doing is taking over a site, a derelict site in the city centre, to be able to take it and change it into being a green cultural growth space. Somewhere where we can come together and share ideas, talk about stuff, and see it through the lens of culture, but be empowered to do something with the partners at the table, make a change for our city with the citizens of our city. What was interesting when we talked to the students was there's a cognitive dissonance going on, and so that the world's on fire. I'm wearing clothes that I don't really want to wear. I don't even know where to go and get stuff that isn't going to cause damage. How do I grow food better? Where do I get better? I don't even know where my food comes from. There is this alarm bell dissonance going on with no solutions, and yet actually there are a lot of solutions. We just need to come together and go, hey, did you know about, and collaborate and make a difference at a societal level, which then obviously is empowering in workplace and everywhere else that we inhabit during the day. So these are the 6 themes that we came up with as a part of, out of all of these workshops, as ways to have a single phrase that you and I can engage with each other. Doesn't matter whether you believe in climate change or you don't. Doesn't matter whether you've got lots of money or you don't. We both eat? Yeah, right. So what about you? What do you think about it? Do you think it's about plastics wrapping around this challenge for you? Is it nutritional food? Is it knowing where your food comes from? Can you afford your food, or are you paying bills instead? These are all things that are going to be subjective and important for us all to recognise if we're going to solve problems together. So we've looked at this through the point of view of having a site to do something and bring people together to feel that they've got a bit of skin in the game. Activities around it so that they've got different demographics, different ways to interact with folks, so that there's actually some value, and tell stories to each other, so that we actually learn from each other, listen to what's important to other people and why it's not working for them if it's working for you. So this is just a quick draft idea of what we can do on the site. Might be that, might be something different, but we've got to find new ways of thinking and acting together. Thank you very much. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Gawain. So just one more intervention from myself, and let me throw it open for questions. And it's rather interesting that the 2 previous speakers, I both work with them, and it's evidence in a way of what happens when people have democratic freedom to experiment and try new things and collaborate. So particularly in relation to what Gawain was talking about, but also reference to what Keith is talking about as well, is this question that has always perplexed me. And it might be something, and again, maybe Keith and I can talk about this afterwards, but as academics, we have high levels of autonomy, even within non-democratic workplaces. And that's why many of us kind of gravitate, well, why can't our work experience now be extended out to other areas in a way? And there are particular issues, because I'm a green political economist. I'm particularly interested in the issues Gawain was mentioning in terms of how I think the solution to the planetary crisis we're now in is more democracy, not less. It's full spectrum democratization in our communities, bringing policy making down to the more local level, but also then in particular in relation to changing the root causes of our planetary crisis lie in the economic system that we have, which is based upon perpetual growth. And I'll describe how that unsustainable growth dynamic justifies and explains the forms of surveillance and non-democratic workplaces that both Keith and Gawain were talking about. This is particularly for Keith because he's interested in the Labour Republican tradition, which goes back to the late 18th, early 19th century. So these are a bunch of female workers in Massachusetts, in Lowell, Massachusetts, and they are articulating a particular Republican argument for workplace democracy. Of course, this is at the early stages of industrialization in America, but there were similar arguments happening in Europe and in Britain and so on. And in particularly, you'll see how this is very Republican in the sense that it's anti-monarchical, anti-feudal in the way that it's being expressed. And indeed, particularly when you have two Southerners like myself and Keith saying Republican, it should go without saying it's this Republican tradition we're talking about and not the other one that people go to when they think about Northern Irish politics. And I'm not going to go through all of my reasons why I think workplace democracy is good, and particularly in relation to why we need to move beyond GDP economic growth. There are four main reasons I think we need to do this, and I'm mostly focused on the first and the last one, the ecological and climate ones and the democratization of society. But there's also an issue that economic growth in our societies hasn't made our societies any less equal. In fact, it's done the opposite. And in fact, economic growth justifies more inequality. And there is a point beyond which more economic growth actually does even add to human well-being and happiness. You know, there are studies that show we are more psychologically distressed when we have 50 brands of toothpaste to choose from than 5. In other words, the confusion between consumer choice and freedom and well-being is something that is probably underappreciated, particularly from a social psychological point of view. So why should we democratize employment? And Keith has outlined them, and Gawain has given some examples. Practically, it's about trying to realize the internal goods of employment and work. And I'm going to use work and employment interchangeably. Even though work is the broader category, employment is remunerated, money paid forms of labour activity. But some of these internal goods of work that Keith mentioned already is in terms of autonomy, conflict resolution, self-organising, having to deal with stuff, the way that Gawain was talking about. And that's some of the reasons why I think it's important to lay out what are the benefits of democratising work. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time because I'm interested in history, and even though I'm a completely collapsed Catholic, not a lapsed one, I am interested in the Bible and religious legacies of our society, and why we have a dominant cultural narrative of the idea of work as disutility. Work is something negative. Therefore, you have to be paid in order to engage in it. And I think that partly justifies the undemocratic organisation of workplaces, and particularly on the issue that Keith mentioned, that we engage in work because if we don't engage in work, okay, we may not die. It's not like it was perhaps 100 years ago. But even with our welfare state that's crumbling, it's not a particularly pleasant choice between working for a job you don't particularly like or go on the dole and having to deal with the indignity. You know, have you seen that film, I, Daniel Blake? You know, it really brings out the indignity and the undermining of self-worth in terms of having to move beyond formally paid employment. And it's this dominant idea that many of us have in our own head, and it's largely cultural, but it's reinforced through, particularly if you studied economics, which I'll talk a little bit about, that even the teaching of economics or the common sense understanding of the economics in our society that you hear, like the likes of John Campbell of the BBC, the economics correspondent, you will get this repetition of this narrative of work as disutility, only engaged in largely for monetary remuneration. And these benefits, I think, we're losing when we organise our workplaces in non-democratic, despotic, authoritarian ways in terms of all of these issues of creativity. It's very hard to be creative in an Amazon fulfillment centre. There's another whole issue about the dissonance and the linguistic reframing. It's a warehouse that's organised upon the logic of algorithms and robots, not for human beings, leading to things like where people cannot even have a toilet break in some places. So where do we get this idea of work as this utility? Well, Exhibit A, my lord, is Judeo-Christianity. And many of you may be familiar, in case you didn't know, Adam's curse is work. And it's God's punishment to Adam and Eve for eating of the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. And you can read it there yourself. So for women, pain in childbirth, and for men, you have to work. Whereas you've got to remember, in the Garden of Eden, they didn't have to work. In fact, they were vegan, in terms of their dietary choices, because the Garden of Eden gave them everything they need. So thrown out of the Garden of Eden, women get pain in labour, and men get work in terms of having to grow their food and so on. But it's repeated in things. You have Yeats here in terms of a poem. And Keith mentioned Philip Pettit, a very eminent contemporary political theorist who studied here at Queen's. Well, another person who also came to Queen's was this geezer, rather complicated character. He actually lived across the road here in our graduate school as the librarian, Philip Larkin. And he has a poem called Toads. And again, it's this idea that work is, at best, it's something we have to grudgingly enter into, or at worst is a threat to our freedom and our sense of a good life. So this dominant view we have of work as negative, and these are some more poetic, cultural dimensions, but there also is a lineage in these dead white guys. And I have to say, we have 3 alive white guys, and we have a bit of a manel here this evening. In fact, it's more than a manel, it's a beardy manel at that. Well, here are 3 other dead white guys who are very eminent in constructing the modern discipline of economics in terms of their views on work. And you can read them there, everybody from Adam Smith, who's on the bottom. Then you have Jeremy Bentham. This is actually Bentham's body. He's really interesting as a philosopher. He had his body embalmed in University College London, so you could go and see him. His head is between his legs at the bottom. So the head you see is a wax one. And then, as somebody already mentioned, John Stuart Mill. But they all have this negative view that there's nothing positive in work. We have to do work. It's Adam's curse, because the earth is not going to give freely of its goods and services for us to enjoy. And this overwhelming view that we only engage in work because we have to, and there has to be a monetary remuneration in order to, entice us to do this. This is why I have a real difficulty with contemporary economic thinking, which sadly is very dominant in shaping public policy, in shaping public narratives around how we understand the economy. And so this is it looks a complicated diagram, but it isn't. And it's called the backward bending supply of labour curve. So if you see here, wages on the x-axis, and the idea is as wages increase, well, yeah, I want more of that. I'm going to fill my boots. I'm going to work more. But then after a point, increasing wages will not call forth more people working. And this is viewed as an anomaly in orthodox economics. To me, it's eminently sensible. You work up until you say, I've got enough. I want to see my family. Why do I want to work at the weekends, even if the wages are higher and they're paying double and triple time? But I think it's an insight into the, in my view, warped view of the human being we have in orthodox economics, that this is seen as an anomaly, something bizarre here about the human condition. And in part, I think it also reflects something that Keith touched upon, the top point here, that the property rights and the power relations within the economy, who owns the means of production, who owns the factory, who gets the benefit of the work that you engage in, are as important as understanding the structure of whether or not you have decision-making and voice within the labour process itself. You want to read all of this. This is a kind of a critique of this orthodox economic view, is this argument that giving people wages and different wages for different jobs is because of the preferences of workers. And so the argument here is that, you see there, the bit that I've bolded, is that people who want to have, enjoyable jobs, the argument is, oh, they'll take low wages because they're going to get a lot of autonomy. But then how does that explain then low-paid work? That's the structure of property rights. That's the structure of the economy, and not necessarily the preferences of workers and labourers. So the issue is really economic power. It's capitalism, a system of for-profit, private ownership of the means of production that is owned and controlled by the owners of capital, and to some extent managers who may have shares in the company as well. So you could say that part of the argument here is that when we're talking about workplace democracy, I think we can have many of the arguments Keith outlined. So, Keith is, as I understand them, is not saying there aren't any psychological benefits in terms of supporting democracy, or there isn't a parallel argument between, well, if democracy is good enough for the state, why isn't it good enough for the workplace? They may be weaker than the one that I would agree with as well, this Republican idea of non-domination and self-worth in terms of understanding the importance of workplace democracy. But it's asking ourselves this question, to go back to what I said at the beginning: why should democracy end at the factory door? Now, there may be reasons that we can come up with as to, here are the reasons why, but they're very rarely offered. And so the argument here is kind of turning the tables and asking, what are the conditions under which, what are the reasons that can be provided for justifying despotic, non-democratic organizations of workplaces? Bet you were expecting this. I love Johnny Cash. And this is a song, some of you may know it, Oni. And it really is part of a long tradition where workers, and it's very much written from a working person's point of view. In his own view, he's always been a defender of the working man, given it the time he's writing, very, very gendered and so on. But I love this song because it's about the revenge of the worker for the indignities that they've experienced over decades in a factory at the hands of his manager, Oni. And it ends with the fact that on his last day at work, the worker is going to punch Oni's lights out. Now, I'm not advocating violence, but it is kind of an indication of that issue that both Keith had touched upon and Gawain, of the indignity of adults being treated like children, or more, in exaggerated terms, are we wage slaves for the 8 hours that we're in work, that more or less we can be treated in often very negative ways? And I think this song touches upon it, but it's part of a long tradition of, if you like, worker resistance in terms of rebelling in some ways against these despotic organized workplaces. And this notion we have culturally, which I think is part of the explanation and understanding of why workplaces are organized non-democratically, because they are viewed, work is viewed in a negative way, is this idea that workers are shirkers. It makes logical sense. If work is something you don't particularly willingly enter into, it's seen as negative, it's a disutility, it's a toil, well then any rational creature would say, I'm going to avoid that when I can. So this idea that every worker is a potential shirker. If the eyes of the boss aren't on them, if there isn't systems in place of surveillance, that workers are going to skive off. And it leads to this really negative discourse that we've seen, certainly in the last 20 years, partly driven by, I think, that larger cultural hinterland of work as this utility. There's also a bigger question about our identity in modern society being largely created around work and so on, and the difficulties that poses, but also a fairly right-wing press, certainly in Britain. So I have an example here at the Daily Mail, where this benefit street, this attack often of people on welfare. Or if you want to look down south, Leo Varadkar, current Taoiseach and head of Fine Gael, when he was going for the Fine Gael leadership, he said he was going to stand up for people who get up early in the morning. And it's this kind of division that a workerist mentality is the most important part of what it is to be in modern society. And I think it has fueled this negative perspective, particularly in terms of the working class as potentially work-shy, skivers, or indeed people who are citizens who happen to be on welfare. So, just to begin to wind up. So productivism, which is this logic of increasing productivity, I think that explains a lot of the non-democratic organization of our workplaces. It's simply more productive to treat people more akin to wage slaves than autonomous human beings with the capacity to self-organize themselves. It's almost like, to use an analogy from another organization that Keith kind of touched upon, the army. The army is organized in a command and control manner. In fact, a lot of the early parading and the training for soldiers is essentially to drill literally into them that, okay, they're not quite automatons, but they're not far off in terms of not questioning command and control decisions. And you could say that in a battlefield situation, there's probably justification for that. If another army is coming to get you and you're in the trenches, do you sit down, okay, lads and lassies, let's have a democratic debate as to how we're going to respond to them? So you could say there are conditions under which non-democratically organized workplaces may be justified, and that may stand as one. But I think in other workplaces, I'm not so sure that logic actually holds. And it does explain, if we see work as disutility, as something that's a toil and negative, and therefore potentially people are going to skive off, it explains these very elaborate and increasingly surveillance forms of workplace democratic organization. You know, that horrible example that Keith gave where, you know, the production line is so quick that you can't even go to the toilet. Or if you do go to the toilet, like in some of these Amazon warehouses, I wish we have a very large one on the Harbour Estate, by the way, just because they go around in electric vehicles, probably powered by green energy, doesn't mean to say that everything they do is good, but that you are timed on your, you know, not just your lunch break, but your toilet breaks and so on. And so there's something about the indignity of having every waking moment you're in the job, you're at the disposal, the arbitrary interference of somebody else in a higher position of authority. And this is just an example of what Keith was talking about, and I'm particularly interested in the Amazonification of our lifestyle. So please, a plea, do not buy stuff on Amazon for Christmas. Go support your local store. Put your money where your house is. But you can see how this model of cheap, just-in-time production is based often on low wages, non-unionized workforces, and also extremely despotic forms of workplace organization that many of us are not, we don't like to see. If you follow the full supply chain, as you know, Gawain said, the conditions under which the things we enjoy every day are produced, it may make us think twice. When you go to Primark and you're buying a fast fashion item, it's usually cheap because the woman, and it largely is a woman in Bangladesh or some other part of the world, isn't being paid a decent wage. The environment of that place is being destroyed, often in terms of it's extremely water and pollution intensive, the production of fast fashion. Never mind that there's a non-recognition often of unions in these places. So this productivity, so we get more per worker by having these non-democratic organizations. In other words, we sweat the assets. We're squeezing the workers to get every bit of productivity out of them to maximize production and, of course, then profit. And I think that is another element of this dominant common sense view that our economies have to grow all the time. Nobody actually stops to say, growth of what? You know, just to give you a very provocative example, the economy does not care if the growth in the sales of books is from porno magazines or Bibles. It doesn't care. It's completely amoral when it comes to this. So we never ask, growth of what? And then the second question, who gets this growth? And mostly the growth is not accruing to the majority in society. It's accruing to an elite of asset managers and wealth creators, in inverted commas, at the top. But most of us have this assumption, intuitive, that we need growth. Growth is good because growth is maturation, it's maturity. We see a child grow, our ideas grow. But also growth can become cancerous. That's what cancer is. It's the point at which healthy cells in an organism have grown beyond the threshold that it's now bad for the organism. And I would say that certainly in countries like the UK, Ireland, and most of Europe, and certainly North America, they are now in a stage of cancerous growth. The growth that is being produced economically is not actually adding to the well-being in those societies. It's accruing to a small elite. And what about the right to useful unemployment? It's a very provocative idea in terms of saying that why is it money and wealth creation and then consumption, that's how we have to live our lives, rather than a meaningful free time? You know, to see that maybe in the 21st century, what we need to do is slow down, selectively deglobalize our economies, relocalize our supply chains rather than globalization, foreign direct investment, growth, productivity, all of which again justifies these non-democratic organizations of our workplaces. So I think we need to start having a serious conversation with ourselves, because this is now getting very serious in terms of the planetary crisis. You know, not 30 miles away, Lough Neagh is not it's not dying, it's being killed as a result of a policy called going for growth, strangely enough, that our previous Environment Minister, Edwin Poots, put in place, agreed by the executive as a whole. But growth, I think there's a local example, but actually we're now experiencing ever more extreme weather events that are partly being exacerbated by climate breakdown. Look at Newry, Downpatrick, Portadown, or Cork, 40-degree heat in London. 15,000 people died this year in Libya because of a storm. We have devastating floods in Pakistan last year, which affected a third of the country at a time. These are going to get more and more severe because of this growth dynamic, particularly based upon the uses of carbon and so on. So the issue here is, why should we see work as this utility? If we change the relations of production, if we change the way work is organized, work doesn't have to be this utility. There can be joy in work. And it is a privilege, as I said at the beginning, the jobs Keith and I have, and Gawain in some ways, or even Alan, who's recording it here tonight, as kind of, we have cultural, creative autonomy to do what we have in terms of our work. We can teach whatever we want, more or less, research more or less what we want. Most workers don't have that freedom. And the issue is why? Why not? If the only strong argument we have is the kind of army argument for non-democratic workplace organization, well, show me how the post office, our health service, our school system cannot be organized in a different way. You're saying the army analogy has to fit. This is a kind of trading on the kind of state argument analogy that Keith was making. So I do think that in democratizing our society, and this is an argument in favor of one of the weak arguments Keith mentioned in terms of, it's partly a psychological, it's a cultural issue. If we don't develop muscles of democratic decision making in what most of us are spending a lot of our waking time in, if we say we have 8 hours work, which is hard won by the trade union movement, by the way, as was the weekend, 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, and then 8 hours sleeping. So for a third of our waking lives, we're in these non-democratic workplaces. How does that then equip us in terms of exercising our capacity to organize stuff? And I would add in the importance of conflict resolution, because certainly, as Gawain alluded to, in the practices in non-hierarchically organized workplaces, you've got to figure stuff out. You know, anarchy people think is easy. Anarchy is really difficult. It takes a lot of time. You know, in a previous life, I was a Green Party councillor for 7 years, and the Green Party is extremely democratically organised, but it's a pain in the arse, because it meant every decision we had to go through had to be by consensus. I remember campaigning back in the 90s in an election down south, and we couldn't actually knock on the doors with our full manifesto because a group in Cork hadn't agreed to the manifesto. So it's that idea that, you know, anarchy and full democratization of organization also has its downsides as well. So again, it's that issue that organizing democratically does take more effort and so on. And I think that's one of the reasons why most workplaces are not organized democratically. It's just more simple. You get the boss, they tell you what to do, and you're back to that army analogy. But I do have a question about whether or not our citizens are equipped to engage in politics. I mean, just take Northern Ireland. We were so in love with democracy, even the dead voted. Whereas now you can see over the last 25 years since the agreement, we are reducing the numbers of people who are engaged in politics. I'm not saying it's all down to do with our non-democratic workplaces. It actually, is probably not more complex, but it certainly doesn't help. Even if the evidence for democratic organisation of workplaces are weak in terms of enhancing democratic citizenship, so what? There are more arguments in favour of democratising workplaces, and so it's up to those who are arguing against it. Shows your evidence. What's your argument for the non-democratic organisation of the workplace? And so for me, I think this is, part of where I, began in terms of why should democracy end at the factory gate? We claim to live in democracies, yet for most of our lives we don't actually live in democratic workplaces. So again, I'm not being utopian or it's a panacea for all our ills, but for me, the argument is, show us the arguments for the non-democratic organisation of workplaces. What's the logic in terms of either empirical evidence or some normative argument for that? So I'll leave it there, and perhaps we can give the two lads a round of applause.